Okay, now that we have looked at some of the reasons for assessment, I would like to say that this course is a course in a special kind of assessment process. It focuses on a special kind of assessment process, a unique kind of assessment process that we will call dynamic assessment. And so this part of today's work that we'll be doing together, we'll be addressing the idea of the process of dynamic assessment and very related concept, mediated learning. What do we mean by dynamic assessment? Well, here's a central principle of dynamic assessment. Bottom line, bottom line, bottom line. All behavior is context sensitive, meaning our behavior is different from situation to situation to situation. It's sensitive and variable across different daily experiences. So we use dynamic assessment in an effort to understand the client's potential and factors that challenge that potential. We use dynamic assessment to control for culture bias inherent in many standard norm-referenced assessments and even in many developmental taxonomies, culture bias. And we use dynamic assessment to promote and identify learning during assessment. That sounds a little weird, doesn't it? Assessment is assessment. We're trying to determine whether or not the client manifests a speech-language problem. Isn't that different from learning? Treatment? Not really. Besides, I always view this and intervention as two sides of one coin. And if you're doing good assessment, a good assessment, sometimes it's very difficult if somebody was looking through the two-way mirror or into the session for that individual to distinguish whether they're looking at an assessment or a treatment. Because in assessment, as we just said, behavior is context sensitive, not just an assessment, in life itself. If you're in, if I'm presenting to you here in a class and we're comfortable and familiar with one another, I don't present exactly the same way as I do say at a conference where I'm speaking to a large audience and I don't know anybody. And quite frankly, this isn't exactly a typical class where you're sitting in front of me. I'm talking to actually a little dot in the middle of my screen. That's the camera. And I have to imagine that you're out there, you see, because as I record this. So I'm presenting, quite frankly, a little differently here than I would be if this was a class where everybody was sitting in front of me. It's the same material. I'm doing the same talking. It's the same material I typically teach when I teach this class, but my behavior is a little different. Well, if during assessment you create a context in which an individual demonstrates a particular speech-language skill or whatever at one level, and then in a different testing situation that day with the client seems to perform better, well, in a sense, you've promoted improvement simply by changing the context. And you might even interact with the client in ways to see if you can't, while you're assessing, promote performance of a behavior that the client seems to have difficulty producing. For example, in the most common example, of course, is in articulation testing, where you evaluate stimulability. So say a client has difficulty producing the S sound, and it's maybe lisping, fronting that sound. Well, you might model for that client, or put a little peanut butter maybe on the alveolar ridge and try to get the client to retract his or her tongue to produce that sound, although they're not producing it naturally. You're, in a sense, intervening in context of assessment. So context sensitivity itself leads to understanding a client's potential and the factors that challenge potential, because you're going to be creating multiple contexts in assessment. You're not going to just be evaluating a client on one single test in one single situation. That will never give you a full picture of the client's potential and the factors that challenge that potential. Thus, we need to be evaluating the client in multiple contexts, and evaluating clients in multiple contexts is exactly what dynamic assessment is all about. And that would be if we create contexts that are familiar to the client and culturally appropriate, that the client has experience with. I'm sorry, I forgot to turn my phone off in the back, so apologize for that. But if you get you may get one level or of behavior, but if you evaluate the client in a more unfamiliar, culturally unfamiliar situation, you may get a different level of behavior. So dynamic assessment, by providing multiple contexts, familiar, culturally appropriate ones, and inappropriate ones, both of which may be relevant to present, you would be working to control for culture bias in many standard norm reference assessment protocols and even developmental taxonomies. You could also maybe modify the actual, if you're doing a standard norm referenced assessment, you may do it in a standard way and then break standard procedures to accommodate the cultural differences of the client. We'll be looking at that across this course. And we want to promote and identify learning during an assessment. That's part of dynamic assessment. So let me move my picture over a little bit so I can more clearly see the slide, and so can you. So what is the implication of dynamic assessment for the design of assessment contexts? I hope you're kind of getting the idea here that that assessment involves creating situations for the client to speak in, and multiple different situations, and you're going to be intentionally designing or creating situations to get the information you wish to get, and to see how the environment is influencing the client's behavior. You're going to be really designing assessment contexts, standard and non-standard contexts. Standard being tests you choose to give the client, tests that are published and provide you with directions for administering that you'll stick with, and situations that are more naturalistic you will be creating. That's exactly what assessment is. Quite frankly, that's what treatment is too. The creation of situations and tasks, etc., that the client engages in that facilitate acquisition. So you're going to be assessing the child's performance in targeted areas across multiple contexts. And you're going to modify the context first with reference to non-linguistic components of the context. That means the materials you'll be providing the client, and I'm going to distinguish between, I always make this strong distinction between symbolic contexts, which are typically speech or involving text material or even pictures. These kinds of materials or these kinds of contexts, those that involve purely talking, or talking and reading, or speaking and writing, or picture identification even, these are symbolic contexts because language is a symbol system. Pictures are symbolic. They're a lower level of symbolic representation than language typically, although they can be also quite complex. And also non-symbolic material. Now that symbolic context can be contrasted with a non-symbolic context, which involves the manipulation. This little picture here you're looking at, that child is manipulating concrete material. Well, the manipulation of concrete material provides sensory motor feedback that speech and language does not, typically. And it really represents another level of processing, which includes movement and sensation, which speech and language involves, of course, the sensation of the speech and language of the phonology, and the movement for creating the articulating the phonology. But outside of that kind of movement and feedback, you don't get the same set of feedback you do when you're manipulating materials. And that is important. So I did, again, strongly distinguish non-linguistic and linguistic contexts for good reason, and we'll get at that reason as we go along here. And let me go back here. And non-linguistic contexts then are involve typically play or physical problem solving, whereas linguistic contexts are typically adult-directed and occur with or without perceptual support. That is, with or without the material that the individual is talking about, which could be pictures, it could be models of one thing or another that the individual is speaking about, perceptual support. Implications of dynamic assessment for preventing cultural bias. We need to modify assessment materials and procedures with reference to the individual's cultural and linguistic characteristics and experiences. Sometimes we want to make it more culturally appropriate. Sometimes we do want to create culturally inappropriate, different, I wouldn't say inappropriate perhaps, but different situations. Because, as I mentioned, the client may find themselves in such situations. And we want to see if that's what's challenging the individual. Implications of dynamic assessment for clinician-client interactions. We mediate performance. We clinicians mediate performance. We mediate, that is, modify experiences intentionally during assessment to manipulate performance demands and explore and promote modifiability and variability of target behavior. That's what I've been speaking about all along. The term performance demands, making things more complex or less complex, simpler, more complex or less complex, more familiar, less familiar for the individual. All of that will influence behavior. And that's what our business in assessment. We're looking to influence behavior. Let me say that there are two approaches to mediated learning and development. What we do during assessment is we actually play around with context to see if we can modify the individual's behavior while we're assessing. So in a sense, we are in fact trying to mediate learning while we assess. And there's two approaches that I identify. One is the Piagetian. There's his picture. He passed a while ago, but my career has very much been connected to this man's work. Piagetian environments involve non-symbolic materials Piagetian contexts promote relationship making, problem recognition, problem solving, and discovery through critical exploration, which involves querying the client or the test taker to get a sense of what's going on in their mind. So we engage the individual in goal-directed activity involving manipulation and relationship making with concrete objects as part of the assessment. We encourage the individual to recognize problems and devise and revise problem-solving procedures. We encourage the individual to reflect upon the feedback and that they're receiving from their efforts and make discoveries. That feedback means information coming back to them as they try to solve problems. And that information in this Piagetian context typically comes through sensory experiences, sometimes the comments of others. And here's a quick example of a constructivist interaction.
Up here. Your job is to make that not go
down. That was an axle task. The next step in that task, by the way, is providing a changing the size of the wheel so that the thing curves, and the child is, or the adult is expected to try to figure out what went wrong, because the thing next time curves and misses the target. The second approach to mediated learning and development is Vygotskian. And the Vygotskian approach is very much connected to the term scaffolding, which engages executive functions, that is, talking to oneself. So we engage the individual in goal-directed activity also, within what's typically referred to as zone of proximal development, within a situation where the individual, it's somewhat familiar, but there's some novel stuff there as well, something that the individual can try to address without it being too beyond their developmental level. And then we provide models, including the procedures for problem solving. In a Piaget situation, the individual doesn't get the procedures. They have to figure it out on their own. But in a scaffolding situation, we provide the procedures and explanations, and then allow the individual to take over as their mastery as they master the skill or the knowledge. So to summarize, dynamic assessment embodies a set of effective techniques for addressing the following considerations in the diagnosis of speech-language disorders. Speech and language performance is sensitive to the context in which the speaker-listener finds herself. Assessment context may be culturally biased, and an important function of assessment is to provide baseline data for intervention planning, and thus we want to modify context to say, these are the contexts that challenge the individual most, and these are contexts that actually facilitate improvement. And that's the road that facilitate improvement. Well, that's the road to intervention, and that's the kind of information you gather during assessment to address that final and most important reason for assessment, to provide the baseline and guidance for the speech-language pathologist to provide intervention if the client is presenting with a speech-language problem. Next up, we're going to talk about how functions of language guide assessment.